Okay, I have one. It is RS number 0766, and it is parent access to records of their child when such child is in the subject of an investigation of abuse or neglect or a sync proceeding. There any questions about that? Any objections? Okay, are there any other requests? Okay, so we'll move right along. We do have a couple of committee members online. Do you see them online? I believe it's Representative Esau and Johnson. Okay, I think they're going to be joining us online if they can. So today we have a presentation by the Casey Family Program, and we're going to be covering a work group that happened this fall. It was on Child Welfare Reimagined, and we have with us in the audience Simone Weil. If you want to just come up and introduce yourself real quick while Misha's getting settled online.
There we go. Red, green, all the kindergarten basics are being tested here. Hello, my name is Simone Weil. I'm a director of public policy for the Casey Family Programs. We're a national philanthropic foundation, and my colleague Misha Martin will actually introduce us a little further. We had the privilege of working with some of your colleagues really over the past few years, very intensely last year, and including some work with the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight. So really excited to see what you all will be discussing, and we want to be a resource because this is a really critically important topic across the country, and we're excited about the dedication to this issue here. So good to see everyone today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Simone. How many of you have never heard of Casey Family Programs? Okay. I mean, me as well until we were on this committee. I have loved what they have presented on. I've loved the research that they've worked on. Jared, do you want to share anything about working with Casey just before we get started?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'd heard of KC in one form or another. They helped out a little bit with the Child Welfare Task Force in 2017, but they were not near as hands-on as they were with this interim work. And they've helped out CSG with a conference, or a session or two at a conference, and they've held a national conference with child welfare policymakers across the state. I have enjoyed my work with them, and I really appreciate the national aspect that they bring to child welfare.
Thank you, Jared. I was going to ask Vice Chair Johnson as well, but so let me just introduce you to Misha Martin. She's going to be online today. She will hopefully be with us in person in a couple of weeks. That is our goal. So Misha Martin joined Casey Family Programs in 2024 as a strategic consultant after spending more than 15 years serving as the Arkansas Department of Human Services in multiple leadership roles, including the Deputy Secretary of Youth and Families. She has a Juris Doctorate and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. She served as the Arkansas Child Welfare Director for over 7 years and is an experienced leader with proven success at managing large-scale system child welfare transformation focused on strengthening families, preventing child maltreatment, ensuring the safety and care of children and youth in foster care. So Misha, are you there? Welcome to committee.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you all, and I apologize that I'm not there in person. I had a prior commitment with my son and a doctor's appointment and could not make it there, but please know I want to be there and hope to be there very soon. It's been such an honor to work with the Kansas Legislature, Representative Owsley, former Representative Kincannon, and the others in this work. And so I will just jump right into my PowerPoint and tell you a little bit more about Casey Family Programs. So I'll give it just a second. I'm not exactly sure how the PowerPoint is going to work. Am I sharing or are y'all sharing? Okay, y'all are sharing. Okay. Thank you so much. I think it's Anthony. Thank you, Mr. Anthony. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Simone told you a little bit, but Casey Family Programs, we're the nation's largest operating foundation focused on safely reducing the need for foster care and building community of hopes. Next slide. Our mission is to provide and improve and ultimately prevent the need for foster care. You can continue on. This is what we believe. I'm going to give just 1 second to kind of read over this because while we really do believe that every child believes a safe, strong, permanent family, we want them to thrive. And we also really believe in community level work to invest in children and families. I'm going to talk more about that in just 1 second so you can move on. And so how we do this work, we really invest in a 5-sector approach. So many of you may have heard how we work hand in hand with child welfare agencies across the nation. In fact, we have a 50-state strategy, but we also believe in a 5-sector approach, which means that we not only work with child welfare leaderships in all the jurisdictions, we also partner with nonprofits, the faith-based sector, the business sector, community agency, as well as other governmental entities like the legislature in figuring out how to invest in hope and ultimately build these communities of hope. Next slide. We are an operating foundation. Many of you are probably more familiar with grant-making foundations. We're a little bit different because we actually provide direct services instead of making grants to other nonprofits. So we have direct service offices in Arizona, California, Idaho, Texas, and Washington. As I mentioned, we have a 50-state strategy, and so we provide consulting and technical assistance across the nation. And we also have a team that's focused on data, research, analysis, and you'll see a lot of that today. And then we have a public policy team, which Simone is a part of and I get to partner with, that works directly with state and federal legislators. And so what we know from working with jurisdictions across the nation and doing deep dives into research, we know that a well-functioning child protection system focuses on prioritizing safety for children that are in immediate risk. So nationally, 1 out of 100 calls to the child abuse and neglect hotlines, only 15 of those calls result in an investigation or assessment. We know that a child protection agency is an essential component of a larger, more robust family well-being system. And it's really the task of child protection agency to identify when there is immediate harm and use evidence-based tools, safety approaches to protect children. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. So next slide. So here's what the data tells us from a very broad high level, that 1 in every 3 children will experience some form of CPS or child protection. Nationally, 69% of children are reported to CPS. It's for neglect, while only 10.3% are reported for physical abuse. And, you know, a lot of times in our communities, when they think of child abuse or neglect, they think about those extreme cases of physical and sexual abuse. But the majority of cases that are coming into child protection, or what it's known in Kansas as DCF, Department of Children and Family, are for neglect. Of the children who actually enter foster care, even though typically child protection actually serves more children in home than in foster care, roughly 75% of them are victims of neglect only. We know that communities are not impacted evenly. So nationally, Black and American Indian, Alaskan Native children are in foster care at rates 1.6 to 2.8 times greater than the proportion of their population. So that's a little bit about Casey Family, and just at a very high level, what a well-functioning child welfare system and the data tells us. So we can go on to the next slide. And I'll really get into, well, here's some best practices, but I'm going to talk about these as we get into the Kansas work. So we can go on to the next slide. So how did we get involved in this Kansas Child Welfare Reimagine project? It was convened in the summer of 2024 by former Chair Representative Susan Kincannon and Representative Owsley, who were leading the Joint Committee on Child Welfare Systems Oversight. And just to tell you a little bit more about what was happening, they were having committee hearings and listening to what was going on, not only in Kansas and the Child Welfare Agency, but also having speakers talk from a national perspective of what was going on in child welfare, and wanted to bring a group of stakeholders together to really provide a roadmap to reimagine and redesign parts of the system. And, you know, with the roadmap comes like not just what can we do this session, but they were thinking about how do you really provide a roadmap that gives a way for Kansas stakeholders, legislators, to keep looking at priorities, a vision, which I'll talk more about, and work on transformation over the next 3 to 5 years versus how do we just fix little things this session and maybe little things next session. How do we create a transformational plan with stakeholders and it be owned by Kansas? So they put together a core team, and that core team included House Majority Leader Chris Croft, DCF Secretary Laura Howard, Child Advocate Carrie Leonard, and Kansas Children's former Executive Director Rachel Marsh, and then as she transitioned, the current Executive Director Crystal Hedrick. We can move on to the next slide. And that core team not only designed a plan of work groups of stakeholders, they also really sat down, had several meetings, and created the vision and the outline and the framework for the stakeholders. So when you pull stakeholders together, you really want to make sure that there's a plan, right? Not that everyone is just, you know, sharing their own stories, but how do we create a framework for these stakeholders to come together and make a plan? They were very intentional about who needs to be on the group, and that included a wide array of stakeholders that really touch child welfare. So legislators, governor's office, the judiciary, prosecutors, law enforcement, education, DCF at multiple levels, the Kansas Children's Alliance, the Child Advocate, mental health, service providers, and of course, individuals with lived experience. And when we say individuals with lived experience, that includes parents that have had children in care, that includes youth who grew up in foster care, that includes kinship providers. I don't like to call them providers, but basically grandmas and grandpas and everyone else that's a relative that has been caring for kids. These work groups were facilitated really by Kansas stakeholders, which I'll talk about in a second, but with support of KC Family Programs, and input included myself, Michael Martinez, who is the strategic consultant for Kansas. He's currently out on sabbatical, so I'm covering for him in that role. Carol Self, Director of Public Policy. You met Simone, and Rob Wyman, who's the Senior Director of Judicial and National Engagement. He's actually doing some additional projects with the judiciary in addition to this Kansas Child Welfare Reimagined project. So next slide, please. The work groups that were established were tasked with reviewing current data, laws, policies, national practice, which Casey tried to help in that arena. And there were some limitations. We did this in a very fast manner. So while 3 months of meeting with stakeholders might feel like an appropriate time period, and the work groups some of them met multiple times a week. While that may seem like a lot of time, 3 months really is a fast time period to really dig into all things child welfare. But this amazing group of stakeholders did that. And they were charged with identifying strategies that can enable Kansas to become a national leader in ensuring the safety of children and supporting families. So next slide. And the vision that the core team, and really I believe that the stakeholders embraced, is right here on this slide, that families and children have access to a robust array of services and support needed to be safe, healthy, and thriving without child protection services. Foster care is only used to address immediate and clear child safety concerns. When foster care is needed, it would be temporary, short-term, and be a targeted intervention. And that foster care is appropriate resource and honors children's family and community connections by prioritizing reunification, family time, and placement with kin. We'll move on. And so I want to say thank you to the two chairs of the work group. I haven't seen them, but my understanding is they're in the room. Jeanette Owens with DCCCA or DECA, and Crystal Hedrick that I mentioned is the executive director of the Children's Alliance. There were two work groups. One was prevention and removal, and the other is foster care through permanency. And the idea was that pretty much each stage of child protection services or each stage of when the Department of Children and Families involved was covered in each of the work groups. Now, today, as I move forward and talk about this work, I'm going to cover it from high-level priorities that came out of the work group. The work groups really got into some details, and they came up with recommendations that will be coming out in a report. So I will not be talking about all of their specific recommendations. I'll be talking about the priorities that came out of this whole project, and then how the national best practices that I can share kind of align, or that legislators can dig in more. I'm actually sharing, I hope that you'll get this PowerPoint because there's links to all the resources that I'll be sharing, but how some of the national practices align with the priorities that came out of the work group. But hopefully at a future date, the work groups, maybe their leaders or someone on the core team can share more of the very specific recommendations that came out. I'll be talking about priorities and how they align, because again, this was meant to be a 3 to 5 year plan. So not just guide what came out of the work groups, but also as the legislature, as the agency is moving the child welfare system forward, they can really look back at the vision and the priorities and see, hey, does this particular idea align with those priorities? What does the national research say on the particular topic? So we'll jump into the priorities that were established by the core team and the work group. I'm going to skip this slide because it lists that there are 5 priorities, and we're going to dig into each one of those priorities. These priorities were established from what came out of the work group. So the first one that we're going to talk about is amend the statutory definition of neglect to exclude poverty as a reason for child maltreatment and family separation, and ensure that children and youth are not placed in foster care because of truancy or to receive mental health services. What we know nationally, you can move on to the next slide. What we know nationally is that Kansas is not alone in the issue that was identified by stakeholders, that children are coming into care to receive not only mental health services, but sometimes developmental disability services, or in need of more intense treatment that is not available. And so instead of entering care because of specific abuse or neglect, though sometimes parents are labeled as it's labeled as an abandonment, it's really the need of services. And so what the work group talked about and identified was a need to really look at the Kansas definition of neglect and make sure that that kids were only coming into care when there was neglect, not poverty issue or truancy issue. And I'll tell you that that recommendation and discussion aligns with the national best practices. Casey Family Programs did an analysis of all 50 states and their definition of neglect. What you'll see here on the slide is on that bottom, there isn't a link to the entire report. It is also available on our website, so you can Google it now and it comes up, but obviously we'll provide you a link. And what Casey found in their research is that many states do have a vague or subjective definitions of parental acts for omission and do not require evidence of serious harm or immediate risk around neglect. Now, Kansas does, in your definition, you do state that neglect can't be due solely to the lack of financial means of a child's parent or other custodian, but the work group wanted to explore that more. In this analysis of the neglect definition, The research really indicates 5 things that states need to look at around when you're considering changing your definition of neglect to make sure that you're not having poverty, that you're not having kids coming in care because of truancy issues, that kids are coming to care because of abuse or neglect not to receive certain services. And Casey had 5 things to focus and look at. Is your definition of neglect focused on the effect of the child? Many times it's states look at a parent's action, but it's not the action coupled with, does it actually impact the child? Was there harm to the child? Is the child actually neglected, or are we just looking at an action from the parent? The second thing is around a pattern. Many times you see that a parent may be tagged with neglect and it's a single incident versus a pattern. So does your definition of neglect consider that really neglect is a pattern, not a single incident? Does it take into account the parental state of mind? What was the intention? Some states look at exceptions. So there might be exceptions for neglect around, and so instead of just having a definition of what is neglect, accepting out some things like around lack of supervision. Did you consider the child's developmental state? It's not just about how old the child is, but did you consider their ability to make a decision? What are the circumstances around being left alone? And then emotional neglect. What Casey's analysis found is a lot of times emotional neglect is very vague in the definition and really hard for individuals to assess or prove what is emotional neglect. So we'll move on to the next slide. So next is the priority. And really, we're going to cover these next 2 priorities together because they go together in many ways. Improve safety and risk decision making and reduce unnecessary family separation by improving cross systems collaboration, providing trauma-informed training, and increasing family engagement by providing prevention services before crisis. And then let's talk about the next priority before I go into national best practices. Review Kansas's statutory removal standards, including police protective custody, and ensure that children are not removed from their home unless there's imminent danger. So if you'll go on to the next slide, this was the work group that I had an opportunity to participate in. And again, I want to say thanks to Jeanette Owens for her leadership. But just to give you a little backstory on that work group, there was a lot of discussion around how kids are removed, who removes them, what's the standard for removal, how were those individuals trained, how was an assessment made, and police protective custody was really discussed. Thankful to the leadership of Deputy Secretary Keys, who participated in that group. She was actually able to come when questions are being asked. She provided some great data around who's removing, how are those removals, not necessarily how they're made, but who. Is this so Kansas is somewhat unique. In Kansas, you have DCF making removal decisions. You have police protective custody. So those are what maybe we call family separation decisions, though technically they are removal. And then you have in some situations the court or the DA presenting to the court for removal. And there's another category, which is when DCF seeks law enforcement support to make a removal. So they're involved in the decision making. So this complex set of situations where you have multiple entities sharing the responsibility and deciding who is removed, when are they removed, and how do they come into foster care, but also how do they come into government's custody? Because there's that window of police protective custody that they're not technically in foster care, but they are separated from their family and in government or police's custody. So to give you some national best practices around this, Casey has several resources that I'll talk a little bit about. The impact of removal on children and families. You'll see a link on all 3 of those bullets. One of those actually leads to a study that was done. It's a really great, is the cure worse than the disease? And in that study, it found that ultimately states with stringent standards for ex parte removal or court removals reaffirm that the notion that children should only be removed as a means of last resort. So why I jump to that is really whatever your standard for removal is really does drive the decision making that happens, whether it be by DCF, whether it be by law enforcement, or it be by courts. So what is that removal standard, and is it helping ensure that kids that are only in imminent danger are placed into foster care? There's some great resources on both the first two bullets to really understand the trauma of separating families. And so, I have worked in states and supported states where, the issue comes up around, should we remove, should we not remove? And you'll hear a stakeholder say, well, we better be cautious and just go ahead and remove. Well, with that type of thinking, you really need to make sure that your stakeholders and decision makers understand the significant trauma of family separation. So you want to ensure that whoever is making those removal decisions, whether it be DCF, who are typically trained in child welfare best practices, or law enforcement, are using evidence-based assessments. We have a great tool here around safety organized practice, which under that umbrella is also structured decision making as well as engagement tools. I can tell you that this particular link is on a KC feature of San Diego system. In Arkansas, we also implemented safety organized practice under my leadership because we really saw in Arkansas that we did not have consistent decision making. So if you were in one county, you might get removed, like that county might see it as immediate danger, whereas in another county, they were interpreting immediate danger as something totally different. And it wasn't just the child welfare workers, it was also included the community and the stakeholders. And in Kansas, law enforcement is a big entity who is making removal decisions. Based on the data that we received from DCF, about 40% of your removals fell under partners that were not DCF. So that could be law enforcement, that could be courts. And that equated, according to the data that they provided us last year, about 364 children were removed by an entity that was not child welfare. So really ensuring that across Kansas you have consistent decision making, but you also have tools not just to determine, is this immediate danger or is this not, but how do you engage with the family even when there is risk or potential danger, and can you mitigate that risk or danger by having a family team meeting, by having a safety plan, by assessing whether another non-custodial parent, obviously I think Kansas has been very focused on relatives and placing with relatives, but there's more to safety planning than just, is there a relative? Like, is there a substance abuse treatment facility that'll take mom and kids? Is there a parent, a non-using parent in the home that maybe wasn't home at the time that law enforcement showed up? So making sure that you're using evidence-based tools to make consistent and good decisions that also include the ability to engage families. So I'll move on to the next recommendation. Oh, let me back up for just 1 second on the priorities. Hold on 1 second. I also wanted to bring up the training piece. That was a recommendation in the work groups for training. And so that also is a part of that priority that we just saw, training. And then I'll mention one other thing that was covered, the cross-system collaboration. And that was brought up in the work group because child welfare does not have after-hours support for law enforcement. So that was discussed heavily within the work group of how do you have the cross-system collaboration that includes child welfare, as they should be the experts supporting law enforcement if law enforcement is continuing to make those decisions in their community. Okay, so next slide. And I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. I'm running a little low. I apologize, Representative Howerton, but I will speed up and I will finish in like the next 5 minutes with these slides and take questions.
You have time, Misha. Just take your time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So this is a priority that I just have to admit I'm very passionate about for my work in Arkansas. But it is a national best practice. Kansas is very much already investing in relatives with your KinVest initiative from a couple of years ago. But as the stakeholders met and talked about relatives, I believe on both work groups, it became clear that while Kansas has done a lot in the relative space, that there is more work to be done to enhance kin first policies and practices to improve outcomes for children and families. So we'll go to the next slide. There is extensive national research and support that promotes the idea that kids do best when they're with their family. So whether that's with their biological family or with meaning their parents or with grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, kids don't just do better when they are placed there. There really needs to be this idea of kin first. So how is kinship how do you design a system where that kinship placement is the first placement, not 3 days, not a month? How do you create a system that really has the perspective of we are going to place kids in their first placement? We did this in Arkansas. This was one of our major initiatives going back to 2016. And I just share that because in that time when I was a leader there, I had stakeholders who had that mentality of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Or I even sat in front of a judge who passionately told me that I was going to kill kids. And I said back to him, no, we want a kin first approach that ensures safety, but I'll also come back to you in a few years with the data to prove that this is going to work. And so I'm happy to report from 2017 on in Arkansas, like I share this in Arkansas because it actually kind of blew my mind. We kept it every year, and the data showed that the children who were placed as their first placement with kin never went to a shelter, never went to an intake facility, never went to a foster home. And we had over 40% consistently of kids placed with kin. Those kids at their first placement with kin, they were faster to permanency, so they exited foster care more timely. They had less maltreatment than any other type of placement, including foster homes. And we were below the national average on foster home maltreatment. And then thirdly, they were more stable. And I know that we struggled with placement stability. Child welfare agencies across the nation struggle with placement stability. That is something that is a struggle in Kansas. But when placed with the kin first, kids are more likely to have better placement stability than any other type of placement. And I share with you my Arkansas experience, but my Arkansas experience does align with the national research that we have that I've provided here some links to specifically on kin. Now, one other thing I want to note, when you create this kin first culture, you have to, and the research, well, you don't have to, but the national research supports that, that you can't just place with a kin and walk off. A kin first system also ensures that you have care and support for the families that you are placing those children with, because we know that poverty rates among kinship caregivers are almost twice the U.S. average. And research has consistently shown that compared to non-kin caregivers, relative caregivers have more limited social networks and resources and less familiar with the normal foster care supports that are in place. And even if your relatives are not more impoverished than the general public, I like to think about, I've met with probably hundreds of relative caregivers over my 16 years in child welfare. And can you individually imagine if you got a call to take in 3 of your nieces and nephews without any notice? Like, do you have enough groceries? Can you afford to go get groceries? But by the way, if you take in little ones, you're buying diapers, you're getting a crib, you may or may not have, you probably don't have a car seat. So taking kids on an emergency basis is very expensive and costly, and kids won't be stable in their placement if there's not a way to support those kinship caregivers. And I know I don't want to take away, Kansas has been very focused on kinship, and there's been a lot of work done. The work group identified that this continues to be an area that needs focus. We'll move on to the next priority. Which it's just one bullet, but oh my goodness, it packs in a whole lot of priorities. But shorten it, and it's so important. A lot of times people think about foster care and the number of children in foster care based on how many kids are coming into the system, and that front door is so important, right? Not just for how many kids you have in care, but I always like to think about like what's best for kids, and if you've got a lot of kids coming in care, you got a lot of trauma too. So not just do you need to focus on the front door and making sure the right kids are in foster care and preventing any kids that don't necessarily have to come into foster care, you also have to be focused on how do you get permanency and the right permanency for kids who are in foster care. And in Kansas, we know that 30% of the kids that are in foster care have been in foster care for more than 2 years. And when that happens, we know that the longer that a kid is in care, this is national research, that the longer a child or youth is in care, the harder it is for them to achieve permanency. So the work groups really focused on shortening the time for children and youth spend in foster care by providing effective services such as quality time, that's visitation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm just going to stop on that visitation for 1 second and say family time. We call it family time. Family time is not just about the parents. I've included some links for national research that really family time is also a benefit for children. There's a lot of trauma and stress for children in foster care when they can't see their family, their parents, and know that they are okay. But sometimes our community perspective is that visitation is all about the parent, and sometimes it's even used as punishment or reward. And we forget about the consequences and the trauma on the children by not allowing them to have quality family time. So, quality family time, as you can tell, I'm passionate about that. Quality family time and eliminating permanency barriers for reunification, subsidized relative guardianship, and adoption. And then on the next slide, we have a lot of resources. I included, I think there's 6 bullets here around permanency, but I will tell you that I had to really like, how do I get the 6 that I want to make sure that are just the best on this slide? Casey has a lot of support and resources around best practices for permanency. And kinship guardianship is one of those recommendations, which a lot of times for years, child welfare has supported subsidized adoptions. But it seems like it was just yesterday, but it's probably been 10 years now. The Fed started supporting kinship guardianship. So payments for guardians who take kinship, and it's a form of permanency, right? So it moves kids out of foster care with their relative, gives them permanency. So there's a great resource there on kinship guardianships. And then Kansas has been a leader nationally around older youth with your Soul initiative, but just that's a great resource on older youth. And while there's great work around Soul and listening to kids and listening and creating connections, there's always more work to be done on how do you focus on helping move those older kids to some type of permanency. And then I included a resource around placement stability, because while this is a challenge for most child welfare agencies around the nation, we know that when there is decreased placement stability, their time to permanency increases. So the more you're moving around in foster care, the more trauma that is happening, the harder and more difficult it is to work a case plan goal like reunification or adoption. And so, but it's not just as easy as, hey, we got to keep this kid in the same placement. There has to be some focused efforts. It could be around kinship care. It could be around the services that are needed to support placements when they're in crisis. And then I've already talked about family time. And I don't know why I went from bottom to top, but I just did on this slide. And then on minimizing family separation, this idea that, and I've already talked about it a little bit, but so much trauma when a family is separated. How do you actually prevent the family separation? And then how do you focus on reunification? How do you make sure, and there's great research here of engaging the parents from the very beginning, that due process, making sure parents know they're right, making sure that they're engaged in the case plan, making sure that they're engaged in court and have parent counsel to represent them so that their interests are heard. Because we know, and both Kansas data supports this, over 50% of your kids are going to go back home to their families, which is a good thing. But if they're going back home, how do you make sure that you're wrapping around and providing the right services and having a court system that supports that goal so that kids can reduce their time in care? I always say back home, I mean, government sucks as a parent. That's no offense to an agency, but best practice supports that that children belong in family. So next slide. Okay, that's what I thought. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm sure I have opened the door for lots of questions. And Representative Howard, if you'd like me to take questions, I'm very open to taking questions.
That would be wonderful. Committee, do we have questions? Who's first? Representative Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First question I have, and thank you for your very informative presentation. With respect to the to DCF's decision for removal, who is it exactly that has that that decisive power to state that a child should be removed? Is that an individual that comes up with that decision, or is that a group or by committee?
So that might be a better question for DCF leadership, but I will tell you we've been digging into it, and I'm sure they will correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that, and I did review the law, it's just been a few weeks since I did. My understanding that when DCF makes the decision to remove, they cannot make that decision in isolation. They have to seek a court order, though there are times that DCF, by their own data that I reviewed, goes to law enforcement, and then law enforcement jointly makes that removal decision. Law enforcement can make a removal decision without a court order. They take a 72-hour hold and then work with the DA or whoever to file a petition for the court to sign an order within 72 hours.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I have a follow-up question. I don't think that she's going to be the correct individual to answer this question with respect to the answer that I got there, but I'm curious about when that removal decision takes place. Is the individual or those individuals what cultural relationship or cultural ties and understanding do they have to the family and or the child being removed? But I'll table that question until we can have DCF or someone answer that.
Though I may not answer that specific question, can I just comment from a national perspective, Representative Howerton?
Yes, you may.
So while I cannot answer your specific question because it is about Kansas practice, I think it's a great question in that we know from national best practices that when you're making child welfare decisions, that you do have to be culturally competent. So a tool like safety, organized practice, or structured decision making that I referenced earlier, that's actually a tool from Evident Change, but Casey has featured it on our website. There are trainings on cultural competencies and understanding different types of cultures to ensure that you're not removing a kid because of a practice you don't understand, that you're actually making a removal decision based on immediate danger and assessing risk factors. I could give you an example if you'd like. I don't think I was super clear, but I'll stop there.
Go ahead if you want to give an example.
Okay, I was trying to maybe come up with not a super extreme example, but I'll use more of a neglect poverty issue that came up probably 10 years ago in my work. We had a particular indigenous people in Arkansas that their families lived all in their houses together. You would have generations of family, which sounds really normal, except they were in super small spaces, and it was normal for them, for kids, 5 or 6 kids, to share a bed, and even adults. Well, back then, the child welfare, I was not in charge then, I was an attorney. they were looking at neglect and actually talking about removal on environmental neglect of like, you have all these people living in the house, mattresses on the floor, kids sharing a bed. But when DCFS, that's what they're called in Arkansas, really engaged with that community, not just that family, really realized it was pretty common practice among that community to have generations of family living together and sharing bed space. And really, that's not a danger to kid, right? Like, that's not maybe my culture, but that's not a harmful incident. And thank goodness those kids didn't get removed, but that really was a cultural competence issue.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that example. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions, committee? Representative Barth.
Thank you, Madam Howerton. And my question, I think, is something you can maybe answer for us, which is, how is like neglect actually measured? Because it's somewhat subjective. And do you have any types of guidelines? And maybe it was in some of the materials that are linked there, but do you have any references that you can provide to us that we should be thinking about? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your question. I also happen to be an attorney and started in child welfare trying child abuse and neglect cases. And I'll tell you that your Kansas neglect definition is very similar, though there are some differences to the Arkansas neglect definition that I actually tried. And it is very, and this is not picking on Kansas or Arkansas. You'll see in that analysis of state definitions, they are pretty subjective. And when you're trying a case and proving elements of law, it is easier to prove a neglect case than it is to prove a sexual abuse case. And so, yes, on the PowerPoint that I presented, there's an analysis of state definitions. And we, not we, but KC Family Programs that I work for did go through and show some of the more subjective language that are in state definitions that make it more broad and more subjective on proving neglect.
Other questions, committee? Okay, Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Misha, for being here. You covered a lot in a short amount of time, and I appreciate you pointing out the time frame of the 3 months that this work occurred in, because a whole lot went in, and I hope a whole lot comes out. And we have discussed the definition of neglect, and I appreciate those. I think I was one that supported making it a priority in the working group. And I do have a question, but Representative Carr's question reminded me, I think it was Dr. Sanders' presentation to the Child Welfare Oversight Committee where he talked about not only cultural competence, but the awareness of cultural bias and the use of like a cultural translator. And I might not be quoting the proper terminology there, but I know I made a note of that somewhere saying that would be good to have an expert, in different cultures, around the state to apply that expertise in different situations. I think my question would be, where does Kansas remain one of the largest outliers nationwide of our practices? I know we are in our structure as far as our private-public system that we have here, but as far as practice goes, I'd be curious what your perspective was where we remained an outlier.
So, not certain I would use outlier, but definitely you have a unique practice around, and it's what I talked about a little bit earlier. You have a unique practice that law enforcement is making removal decisions in isolation of the child welfare agency. So it is pretty normal around the nation that law enforcement has the authority to remove. But I think you also heard I'm not sure if this whole committee, but some of the legislature heard a presentation from Ann Helligenstein, who's the former commissioner in Texas. She's also a KC Family Programs colleague, talk about how, law enforcement does make removal decisions in Texas. By the way, in Arkansas, law enforcement can also make removal decision making, but it's in partnership with the child welfare agency. So what that really means is if law enforcement shows up to an emergency situation in, at let's say 11 p.m. in the evening, there's the ability to call child welfare, have someone on call show up who's trained in safety organized practice, who's trained not just in the assessment of is this immediate danger, but knows the community services. Do I need to get mom to treatment program? Do I need to look up the child maltreatment history? That came up on the Kansas work group, that law enforcement does not have the ability to look up the child maltreatment history on a family, because history, we know, is one of the biggest indicators that we should be looking at. Not that if you have history, you're automatically offending. That's not what I'm saying. But you do use history in a proper safety and risk assessment. Is this a first incident versus a fifth incident? But what is the incident, right? And so I would just say that the dynamics of the police protective custody in Kansas are very unique and probably an outlier. There's also, I mentioned this in my presentation, but there's a link to it. A cure is worse than the disease research article that does give a full analysis of like what states are using law enforcement versus not. But ultimately, it's also not an assessment of who is using law enforcement without that. Now, let me also say in Kansas, like every other state, everything is not happening exactly the same in every county. So even though DCF may only work 8 to 5, I guarantee there is a rural county in Kansas that the sheriff has created a great relationship with the local DCF entity, and they are collaborating together. But you will also see, and the data supports it, that there are other counties where removals are being made. Police are then, what else is unique about Kansas is that law enforcement is responsible for that care and custody for 72 hours. So your statutory model, well, again, the practice may vary across counties, but your statutory model of police taking custody, being responsible for 72 hours and going to a juvenile intake facility known as JIAC is a unique model.
I'm sure I have a follow-up, but I'll let the committee continue. I gather my thoughts.
Anyone else? Questions? Jesse, you have a question.
No, I don't.
Okay, a statement.
Yes, so members of the committee, the instances of the police protective custody that Ms. Martin is speaking of can be found in 382231. So if you're looking for the specific language that governs those processes, that's the statute you will look at. It is under subsection B, and it's limited to four reasons. So if you're looking at delving deeper into that, that is the statute that governs that process.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Any other questions? I know. Okay. So I have a question. What is the average time for Kansas kids to be in foster care? Do we have any information on that was presented, or data?
I do, like KC Family, well, we get some data from DCF, and we do get that data. I apologize, Representative Howerton. I do not have it specifically in front of me, but we can follow up with it. The data that I quoted was that 30% of your kids are in care more than 2 years.
Okay, Deputy Director Tanya Keys is here. If you do you have that data available? Okay, perfect. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Hi, Tanya Keys, Department for Children and Families, Deputy Secretary. The information on average length of stay was presented last week in your overview, but just as a reminder, so for all children in care who leave care, the average number of months in care is 25 months. For those reintegrated, the average number of months in care when they leave for reunification is 12 months. And if they're leaving for the reason of adoption, the average number of months is 42. But for all children who leave care, the average is 24 months. I'm sorry, 25 months as of November data.
Thank you. I should have brought that with me. I just couldn't remember. Thank you for having that. Did you get your thoughts together? Okay. It was, I think, shocking to a couple of us on the call, just the involvement of the police protective custody issue and how that actually worked out. And there was some lack of data on that. Do you want to address that, Deputy Secretary? If you want to come up. Because I think you had some information on that as well.
Sure, thank you for the question. And I do wish to clarify, and for those who aren't aware, so when there's a worry about a child that they might not be able to safely remain at home, our practice model around the safety piece, safety organized practice, is to use team decision-making. Talked a little bit about that last week, that, a family comes to our attention, we do our assessment, we're alongside the family, we're engaged, and depending on the circumstances, if there's a worry that the child might not be able to stay at home, we do use team decision-making, which was referenced by Ms. Martin. It is, she also mentioned evident change. We work with evident change in their tool, team decision-making, for about 5 years. We want the family and their network to come together to help us identify the safest decision for the child. Sometimes the safest decision is foster care. So if we're not able to find safely an alternative and talk to the family about an alternative, the safest decision might be foster care. The police protective custody, we do have a lot of data on that. We know we're able to see if a child entered foster care, did they have what we would call a law enforcement plan instead of a child custody plan? Did they have that within 6 days prior? So that it's probably a pretty good idea that that episode of foster care started with a law enforcement police protective custody. So we have data on that. We have data by judicial district, by county. We know that some parts of the state experience more episodes of police protective custody than others. We don't always know why the data says what it says, but we do have data on the frequency of law enforcement plans, police protective custody, and we also received some information from the Department of Corrections on their Juvenile Intake and Assessment Center, their information system that captures when children are coming in for a child in need of care reason. They have sort of a subset of categories on their presenting situation as a JIAC, so we have that data as well, and some of that was some of you may have seen it as part of that Child Welfare Reimagined, but we do have data on that for last year.
Okay, and I think we'll get together and have a committee on that, and we can go over all that data. I think that would be wonderful. And I think just while you're up here, I don't think I realized DCF before this, this fall, that you guys weren't 24 hours. So do you want to address that real quickly?
Sure. For the purpose of our intake and assessment, in terms of going out and meeting families when we're assigned a report, that responsibility happens during daytime hours between 8 and 5 in terms of an authority that we have. Our agency accepts reports 24/7, 365 through the Kansas Protection Report Center. So if someone has a worry and wants to call us and say they're worried about a family, they have access to that 24/7. You can call us. You can also do a report online if that's easier for you. So our 24/7 access is through making reports. You can always contact us. But if there's a decision that we need to assign a report for someone to go out and meet with a family, that responsibility is typically day business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. We do work later. We do respond jointly with law enforcement in any jurisdiction, so that can take us later into the evening. And we do have Sedgwick County and Wichita have some additional tools. So in Wichita, they have the Exploited and Missing Children's Unit, and we're co-located with them. So there's an additional connections and staffing that are joint together. So they respond a lot immediately together, and they do work later and able to go out later. There are also a number of jurisdictions, including City of Wichita and Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office, primarily, and I think Pittsburgh, where they have a relationship set up so patrol officers or maybe supervisors of patrol officer can call a supervisor. They have a designated number or phone to call, and so they do have those relationships. So as was mentioned, there are some pockets in the state that do have protocols in place to respond jointly or to be available by phone call if either patrol or a supervisor of patrol officers just maybe needs some input. With the city of Wichita, their police departments, they have 3 licenses to access our information system so they can see history. So for example, I'm not sure if it's their records department or their dispatchers or their community service officers that they have with the police department, but they can get into the DCF. We have a data sharing agreement, and we cover the cost of their licenses, so they can type into our information system called KIPS, and they can see the agency history of a family. That's one thing that Misha had mentioned. So there are pockets of the state that have greater access or communication with DCF after hours than others.
Okay, thank you very much. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Tanya. Tanya, I'm sorry, Madam Deputy Secretary. So the reporting center is staffed 24/7, and is that involved not just for the person answering the call, but the person that would go through the decision-making tree of how to prioritize that call? I mean, are supervisors on the clock 24/7 as well?
It is at a minimum staffed with our protection specialist roles. There are times when supervisors are also available, and they additionally may be on staff to take a call, for example, if they're covering for someone who's sick or ill. So there are coverage, but generally, child protection specialists who are not supervisors are generally 24/7, would be taking calls, responding to any online, or we call them web reports. And we also receive faxes, for example, from some county or juvenile intake and assessment centers. So however we receive it, it's generally a child protection specialist who's on the other line reviewing the information and making those decisions about a screening decision.
Madam Chair, if I may, the cities that have the agreement for the extended hours access, is that also 24/7? And if so, how long has that been in place, and what do we do to expand it?
It's my understanding that the access is 24/7, or the availability to contact a supervisor is 24/7. It's also my understanding that it doesn't always happen 24/7. It may just happen late until the evening. I'm going to be asking our regional directors to give us a little feedback on what time those calls go in, but the agreement is for 24/7, but I want to be honest that I don't think it happens all the time that law enforcement are calling us. We've been talking, thank you for the question on what do we do to expand it. We've been talking with Ed Klump, and what we're thinking about is, one, knowing how often it happens so we can understand the resources we need and the type of support that's needed, and maybe picking a couple of additional cities that don't currently have it, and seeing what kind of resources it might take.
I appreciate that, and I don't know if that's the pilot program that the Secretary and I have spoken about, with Sedgwick County and DCF in the past, but I did have one more question. You were speaking of the team decision-making, and in the instance of after 5 in a location where law enforcement doesn't have 24/7 access to a DCF investigator, but a child is removed, how does the TDM work in a situation like that where a law enforcement officer with their limited training has decided that the child is, in danger?
Sure, thank you for the question. So depending on the time If it's an instance where law enforcement is responding, for example, to just a general call, and when they arrive, they have safety concerns, and they go through their framework and their protocol to contact a supervisor, and they're worried that there's harm, and without removing the children, there could be further harm if they make that decision, depending on what day it is. We would, the next business day, they would send a report to the department, and we would assign that, and we would, the next business day, DCF, meet with the family, certainly jointly investigate anything relevant with law enforcement that they might have found. And then we have 72 hours to gather information, talk with the family, organize and set up a team decision-making meeting as quickly as possible to understand the safety decisions, and if the network can come up with a plan, a safest decision for the child so they didn't need to be separated from their family. That's one scenario with it. The law enforcement information around police protective custody is reviewed and forwarded to assistant county or district attorney simultaneous to that.
So it's already too late to prevent the removal of that child at that point.
The child may have been already separated from family. Certain law enforcement does have an ability to deliver a child to a juvenile intake and assessment center, a relative, or others. So there's a statutory framework around where a law enforcement officer can deliver a child. That could include a relative. So there are variables in that. But yes, if a law enforcement officer makes a decision to separate a child from their family, if that's the only option, that no one else can leave, the child needs to leave, yes, they would be separated from family, but there is an opportunity to prevent temporary custody to the secretary for foster care.
Representative Carr and then Representative Riley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Deputy. With respect to the Child Protective Specialist, what qualifications are required to be in that position?
And thank you for the question, Chair and Representative. The minimum qualifications for a child protective specialist are, there are some exceptions, but typically a 4-year degree in social work or similar related field for human services. That's in terms of educational requirements. Certainly when they're hired with us, they go through training and pieces around our policies, our procedures, and child welfare practices in our practice model. But the educational requirements are a 4-year degree in social work or related human services field. There are some exceptions. For example, if someone's been working for us in a different role for a couple of years, or they have an associate's degree in a related field and experience in child welfare or child and family well-being programs, for example, maybe child care or early childhood. There are some exceptions that we can hire folks with a 2-year associate's degree or educational equivalent number of hours.
And if I might add a follow-up. So with respect to that somewhat varied amount of qualifications, when we talk about a supervisor, that someone that's in a supervisory position, are those the same requirements there, or are those somehow more specific or separate?
Minimum qualifications for a supervisor require prior experience, for example, 2 years prior experience in child and family well-being or a related field.
Would that be it?
Yes, or I think if they have a master's degree, it could be substituted in lieu of experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. my thinking kind of expands right down the roll here that Representative Carr is going at, that you're having this group with, you're talking about most of that group, or a key part of that group is the mental health person that's helping make that decision as far as this lifelong choice here of what's going to happen. And I'm not a mental health person. I'm married to a mental health person, so I know some of those stages, and it just doesn't seem like that you have the same kind of maturity, the same kind of experience with someone that has just came out of college, maybe even for 2 years. Their whole experience has been the lifestyle of a college student, which is probably somebody that's had a family that's done well for you in order to do that. Not saying that's all the exceptions, but someone that is not necessarily seen a lot of hard knocks. And you compare that with somebody that's a mental health person that has a clinical rating, clinical specialist, whether that's a counselor or a social worker, or whether that's a marriage and family therapist that has a C by their name for clinical specialist. Just feels like someone with that kind of experience, understanding people better, understanding family relationships better, understanding how systems work, family systems work, would give you a whole lot more insight in making this kind of decision when you're giving that decision over to a judge and to the police officer and everything, making this immediate decision. So it just feels like it needs to be a higher level person from the mental health person rather than a case. The only word I can think of is a caseworker input to do that job. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Would you like to respond, Secretary?
Thank you for the comment. Just perhaps an opportunity for clarity in terms of when there might be worries about a child's safety, would you gather the family for team decision-making in their network? There could be other providers, maybe folks from the school, maybe any mental health professionals they've been working with or others who are helping them. They're included. It's the family's meeting, so the family also gets to invite folks for everyone to talk together about the safest decision for the child. If that safest decision is for foster care, then DCF does not have the authority to remove. We would present that information in an application for petition to the county or district attorney for a judge to review. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify that we don't make the decision for removal. We gather team decision making for the safest decision for the child.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Misha if she just has any last comments. Are there any other questions while she's getting ready? Okay, Misha, thank you very much for your day, or for being here today.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. Greatly appreciate Deputy Secretary Keys adding those Kansas specifics, and I did want to just apologize to her and Secretary Howard, because when I mentioned organized safety practice, I was aware that the DCFS team has implemented, in fact, the team decision-making lead, and I apologize, I don't know her title. She was on the work group and is phenomenal. She gave great input. So I definitely want to applaud DCFS in their implementation of safety organized practice and some of those tools like team decision-making. And as I think the data shows that their implementation has been working, because there is over the years a decrease in the removals that are linked with DCF, but the data also shows that the police protective custody, or I believe the way DCF characterizes it, non-DCF removals, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there are multiple entities besides just police protective custody, but those non-DCF removals, those have remained steady according to the data that was provided to the work group. And those priorities that were established by the work group was training around all individuals that are making removal decisions, which is why I included that safety organized practice, which, as she mentioned, is both a decision-making structure like structured decision-making or family engagement tools that include team decision-making. So I just wanted to clarify and also apologize to the secretary and the deputy secretary around why I included that and how the data maybe supported that. Oh, and I guess I should stop there and say thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present and the opportunity to work with you all as well as Kansas stakeholders. I am right now I partner with public policy, but I'm also the assigned strategic consultant for Kansas through February, but I'm sure I will continue the work, and I hope to be present with you all on February 10th. So thank you, Representative Howerton, for the opportunity to present on the work group as well as the national best practices.
Okay, thank you very much, Misha, for being here, and we do look forward to seeing you in person. If you have any questions about Casey Family, Simone is here and available, I believe, if you want to meet with her individually. A couple of things before we end committee, if I could find my right notes.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead. Yes, Representative Valsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Misha, again, and I hope this isn't the last time we see Casey Family in front of this committee. And thank you to Deputy Secretary Keys. And Ed Klemp was mentioned earlier, and his input on these working groups was extremely valuable. And sometimes when I look at Kansas child welfare, I think, man, we still got a lot of improvements. And other times I look back and think of how far we've come just in my time that I've been here trying to assist from this position. So I just wanted to put that out there, and thank you.
And I am talking to Ed Klump, and we're going to be having him in committee as well in a near future session. Okay, so there was a change in the agenda. It was emailed out. So on Wednesday, we are going to have hearing on HB 2075. That is moving the permanency from 12 months to 9 months. So that will be in here on Wednesday. And then the minutes have been emailed you, and they are on the S drive. We'll look at approving those on Wednesday as well. Is there any last questions or comment for the committee? Okay, we're adjourned.